And here we are. Hi, I'm Vern Thiessen, and welcome to Facebook Live. And here we are at Matara, post-performance, and I'm going to turn it over to our outreach coordinator, Roland Lines, who I'm hiding with my hat right now. And he's going to introduce our special guest today and the discussion that we're having. So here we go. I'll turn it over to you, Roland.
Thank you, Vern. And I'm here with Jessica Eisen, who just recently joined the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. And one of her areas of expertise is animal law. So she will be talking about animal welfare more generally than just zoo animals, as it relates particularly to legal parameters around how we protect animals and different ideas around that. So Jessica, I know that you recently came from Harvard, actually, and maybe you can tell people a little about what you were studying there.
Sure. So I am actually still in the final stages of my degree. I have to correct people, not yet Dr. Eisen. I will be officially graduating this coming May, hopefully, but I have started on the faculty at the University of Alberta. So my dissertation work at Harvard was focused on the different aspects of sort of modern states and how they interact with the problems posed by contemporary uses of animals. So just as a kind of entry point for people who don't have background in the legal side of animal protection, the sort of general framework, the argument within animal law about how to conceive of the human obligations to animals through law is usually debated in terms of whether or not we should think about animals as having welfare needs that need to be balanced against human interests, or thinking about animals as having rights, sort of basements below which their treatment should never fall regardless of the human interest in the balance. And a lot of the discussion in animal law sort of takes the form of arguing about which of those is the best way to think about it. This is a discussion that has a long pedigree among philosophers. People who have training in that area will know this as utilitarianism versus deontology. And what I did in my research was try to shift away from thinking about sort of what is the moral shape of our obligation towards animals, towards thinking about what do states look like? What do governments look like? What are their components, and what does it mean to think about our relationships with animals through those lenses? So as a part of that, the first part of my project considered the relationship between democracy and animal protection. So instead of thinking about animal protection as a question of fighting for rights versus striking a balance, the question of how sort of the institutions of democracy, the ways that public opinion, shifts in public opinion impact the choices that we make. And it's not just a sort of product of a moral calculation, but a product of sort of discourse among different people who are coming from different perspectives. A second institutional or component of state angle I looked at was the ways that constitutions can protect animals. And there are actually a number of constitutions around the world that include protections for animals. And so inquiring into what it means to protect animals through that mechanism of the state. And finally, looking at sort of background regulations, things we don't think of as having to do with animal protection, things like dietary guidelines or subsidies for agriculture, and how those kind of regulatory choices end up having an impact on the lives of animals as well.
So before we take some questions from the audience, if you do have any questions, I was wondering as well, just what was your initial reaction to the play? I know that zoos and zoo animals aren't within your expertise, but I mean, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how you reacted to the play.
Sure. So I found the play fascinating. It touched on a particular theme that has been really important for me in my research, which is sort of the question of who speaks for animals, who has the authority among our human community of people who sort of share a certain who share language, which is so important to law and legal protections, how we have a system that is predicated on speech and sort of written laws and written judicial decisions, oral arguments in court, what it means to think about that kind of system as protecting the interests of animals, and what it takes to have any kind of authority when talking about what animals want or need in terms of our protection. So, there was this kind of persistent kind of background question of what does Matara want? Who has the right to speak for Matara? Is this psychologist going to be this elephant psychologist going to be in a position to make an authoritative claim? Is the human person, the zookeeper who spends all her time with Matara, in a position to make an authoritative claim about the experience of this animal? And, throughout, one of the things I admired about the play is that we were not sort of given a very clean answer. I think we were encouraged to feel that this was an animal who was suffering in part because of the loneliness of not having communicative partners, other elephants who could, perhaps better than we, understand and respond to what she was going through and what she needed. But this challenge of thinking through what it means, even on an ethical level, to try to have relationships with animals that we have confined, and to think through what it means to, what the nature of the obligation is to try to understand across difference in the context of the relations we have with animals, and then the sort of added challenge of what it means to not just, understand and communicate in a way that, you would in a sort of intimate or one-on-one relationship, but then to translate that into legal relationships where there are things that need to be proven, standards, tests, what it means to actually try to make claims that have the authority of law when speaking about animals. So that was a theme that for the play was really, that in this play was really exciting for me, because I think it's very easy when dealing with animals to sort of treat them as symbols or as sort of emblems of aspects of our human experience. But I really felt in this play that Matara was represented as an entity who was mysterious, who was not a emblem of what we think or feel, or that there was this sort of missing piece of her expression. And the sort of image of the, I don't know if puppet would be the right word. I'm getting a nod from people in the theater. But this representation of her as being kind of animated by the impressions of the people around her, I thought that was really beautiful. But at the same time, never sort of letting us think that animation, those representations were a sort of substitute for the fact that there was this actual subject behind all of that who was having an experience independent of how the human beings around her were engaging with her.
Thank you. And if somebody does have a question, you might have to call out because I can't see very well. But first, although Jessica's expertise is on the legal side, I do have a fair bit of knowledge of the animal welfare pieces. And so if you have any questions around that, you can ask those questions as well, and I will attempt to answer them. I know one thing that the play talks about a couple times is what the character of Karen refers to as stereotypic behavior, which may be unfamiliar to people, and that's the repetitive behavior that animals in captivity often develop. It is one of the markers of a breakdown in the animal's welfare from a behavioral point of view. It indicates that there is some need, some instinctive need that they're not able to meet. And so in an elephant, swaying behavior is one of the stereotypic behaviors. And so because Karen makes mention of that, that is significant in terms of her trying to understand what the welfare state is for Matara and what might she need to avoid that stereotypic behavior. So does anyone have any questions? Vern?
I have a bunch. So I'll start on this one. In terms of your research, I'm wondering, is Canada ahead of the curve, behind the curve on some of these laws to protect animals? Where do we sit as a country?
So I am sorry to report that probably behind the curve in terms of sort of comparable jurisdictions. It's interesting because there are kind of many aspects of Canada's regulatory state that seem to have more in common with what you see in Europe as opposed to what you see in the United States. But the context of animal protection is one area where, in fact, our system is a lot closer to what you see in the United States, and that is sort of a lower standard of protection. And that applies across the board in terms of animals that are held in captivity for entertainment, animals that are farmed, and even sort of protections for pet animals. So I actually think that this is an area where we're going to see some change in Canada in the next couple decades. I mean, this stuff happens slowly, but you know, my impression is that the Canadian public, when many of these issues are brought to their attention, are surprised to find that Canada is where it is relative to other jurisdictions, and that there are things that could be being done that aren't. And so I think, you know, it's a lot of work for animal advocates to bring those issues to light, but there are things that can be done. On the other side, you know, I don't want to suggest that Canada and the United States are identical. There are differences, and there are some ways in which particularly farmed animals in Canada have some sort of specific ways in which their conditions are better. So, you know, a large component of my research has focused on dairy. And the difference in the United States and Canada, you know, traces in part onto the sort of background economic systems that are surrounding dairying in the two countries. So the United States, to sort of oversimplify, has a system that sort of encourages production of dairy sort of far in excess of domestic demand, whereas Canada, as I'm sure you've seen in the papers, has this controversial sort of supply managed system where there ends up being sort of a little bit less pressure to produce in huge excess of what's demanded. And so kind of because of that slight difference in context, it's allowed for some differences in regulation. So for example, in Canada, subtherapeutic antibiotics, the use of growth hormones that are known to cause digestive problems aren't used while they remain legal in the United States. They're not permitted in Canada. So there are sort of some granular differences, particularly in that area, but you know, on the whole, Canada is probably not a sort of gold star jurisdiction in terms of its treatment of animals. So that's something for us all to think about and work on.
Well, and just a follow-up question to that, and then I'll promise I'll stop talking. You just made a differentiation between kind of animals, and people like me who are rather ignorant of these things, is like, how does the grade of animals on the curve work? Like, do people, like what is the spectrum in terms of when we're talking about animals, what are we talking about in terms of protecting animals from the sparrow, as Romney talks about, when she talks about that big kind of view to the tiger at the top of the thing. I mean, how do you think about animals in terms of that big unit? It's a big term.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I will turn it back to you
Sure.
for that legal perspective, but I know from my work at the Alberta SPCA, I know that the protections and regulations around use of animals is typically segregated into what particular industry they're being used in. I know Alberta, actually the provincial sort of umbrella or legislation, the Animal Protection Act, does apply to all non-human animals. And so it could be applied to invertebrates as well as any vertebrates if there were a case to do so. But I know in many other provinces, the Animal Protection Act only applies to companion animals, and they have a completely separate legislation that protects livestock. I know also that there is separate legislation for animals used in research facilities. Zoos, so in Alberta, although the zoo animals do fall under the Animal Protection Act, there is a separate piece of legislation the Wildlife Act, which governs the regulation of zoos themselves. And often it's the regulatory side, at least in the Canadian context as I understand it, it's the regulatory side that has the more preventive options, the things you must do before you have the animal. Whereas the Animal Protection Act is more the reaction to a report of mistreatment of an animal. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind is, are you looking at legislation that tries to prevent bad things from happening, or are you looking at legislation that punishes people when they do something bad? And your thoughts on this?
Thank you. So that's really useful and a very good question. So I just want to echo Roland's point that in fact, most of the time, our legislative solutions are not hugely focused on the capacities or needs of the animals, but are instead focused on kind of what we would like to do with them. So even in the context of Alberta's Animal Protection Act, which on its face seems to would appear to protect all animals, there sort of is an exception in that legislation for common agricultural practices, for things that are kind of in the normal vein of animal husbandry. And so that ends up sort of really limiting the extent to which that legislation can challenge anything that is business as usual or in the sort of realm of business as usual in farming, which some people think ends up in practice looking an awful lot like an exception for farmed animals. So you end up seeing this kind of focus on particularly agricultural use as being sort of an area where even if there are some areas in which we want to offer protections, the imperative to provide animal products in our food system ends up carving out a separate legal arena for those animals that is not predicated on questions about their capacity. So the question that you were posing is about sort of, as I understood it, was sort of more generally sort of how do we draw the line in our thinking about these sort of non-human entities. And this is a question that I encounter a lot. People sort of asking, well, once we sort of, open the door a crack to say that we're going to consider the elephant or sort of other, what sometimes people in the animal law world refer to as charismatic megafauna, sort of big, huge, smart, exciting, cool-looking animals. That once we do that, are we not inviting ourselves into a situation where the very common example is a mosquito that's carrying malaria? Do we have an obligation to not try to eradicate those animals? And so, I don't know that there is a clear answer, and I can tell you how I approach that question, which I know others have found unsatisfying, and maybe you will as well. But my own take on this is that there are so many animals who so clearly have social and emotional lives and needs, and who are caught in industrial systems where there is kind of to my mind, obvious imperative to make changes in those areas. That we can look at, a dairy cow or a broiler chicken, and these are not sort of black boxes, and we're unable to access their experiences or know anything about whether or not they are suffering in captivity. These are cases where there's not much doubt that the conditions of confinement are causing them suffering, and they're extremely widespread. And so sort of a very pithy way that I've seen this put by Sue Donaldson and Will Kenlick at Queen's University, the idea that the animals whose sentience is least in doubt are the ones who are facing the most sort of severe conditions. So I tend to think about animal law as a political project, which allows me to kind of sidestep the kind of tricky sort of moral philosophy questions about the malaria-carrying mosquito. But I think, that's sort of a product of my own focus and my own work. I don't think that resolves the problem, and I think that it's really important for particularly moral philosophers tend to do work in this area to continue trying to come up with rationales and explanations that people find compelling. Because I think that even people who want to do right by animals, people who are uncomfortable with the status quo, are also uncomfortable with the idea of sort of opening the proverbial barn door. And where does it leave us if we really take these interests seriously? What's the nature of the transformation that animal rights advocates or animal welfare advocates are asking us as a society to make? And I think sometimes we can answer that question with sort of incremental improvements that sort of reasonable people can agree on. But I think that, that question is not just a sort of philosophy problem in the distance. It's a real thing that holds people back from committing themselves sort of emotionally and politically to these questions. And so, I have a sort of provisional way of thinking about it that makes sense to me, but I think it's important that kind of we all as a society think through and talk through what we do think makes sense in terms of where we're drawing lines and when questions of drawing lines are even the right questions, whether there are some circumstances where we can take action on a particularly clear case without necessarily seeing all the way through to the end. But thank you for that.
Oh, you go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the idea of zoos, as expressed by others here, partly was to create some kind of relationship between people who don't live near these animals and the animals and to person empathy. Yet the numbers of these kind of animals are decreasing, and so is this a reasonable argument to have animals in captivity in our areas, and what might be a good way to go about keeping these animals from less and less?
I will encourage you, if you can, to come back on Tuesday, because we will actually have a conservation scientist who will be speaking on Tuesday. I know that she herself is in favor of zoos, but she said to me as well that it's been a trajectory. And so in the play, I think it was Marcel's character was talking about how some of the earliest zoos in the Western world were royal menageries. And so like there used to be in the Tower of London animals in horrible cages. But the British Zoological Society is now one of the leading conservation organizations in the world that is, and they still operate, I believe, 3 zoos in Britain. And in New York, the Wildlife Conservation Society operates the Bronx Zoo and a couple other zoos in New York City. Dr. St. Clair told me both of those organizations are very important for wildlife research, for endangered species management, and she admits that there's more work that needs to be done. And I think one of the tensions that the play itself does draw out is if the zoo is going to be there and have funding to carry out conservation programs, in our current society, the way that it gets that funding is by putting animals on display. The question of whether or not a zoo animal is a true educational experience, it has been raised by a lot of people. When a person goes to a zoo and sees an elephant or sees a lion, are they really getting an understanding of that animal that has meaning to their biology? Like, are you learning natural history if you see an animal in a zoo? And I know there's both sides of that do debate that quite vigorously. And there's always more that can be done around it. I think I saw another hand, yes. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add a small point on this. I think something that I always think about in connection with the educational component of zoos is not just the question of whether that's a sort of deficient way to teach children and adults about, what these animals really are, because a huge part of what they are is how they live and interact with their ecosystems, but also sort of what really do we teach children about animals when we take them to places where they are enclosed, where they're captive, where we're staring at them, where there's a sort of underlying message that our experience for that afternoon is more important than that entire animal's life. And, I think there's a lot that we are working through together as a society about what we think our relationship to other animals should be. But a concern that I have about zoos goes beyond just, is it good enough at teaching what it says it teaches, but also what else is it teaching? And are zoos teaching really a message of respect? Are they teaching a message of sort of relating to others who have less power and who are very different in body and mind, as animals are from us? That sort of what that difference kind of authorizes in terms of our treatment of them. And so this is sort of another set of questions that I think is related to the very good one that you raised. Just wanted to throw that in there.
We have time for one more question over here, yes, and then afterward, that's our formal end, and then perhaps we can further discussion in the lobby if people have further questions. So yes, please.
Not so much a question as I guess just comment, very much like what you said. And I thought the play was fabulous for presenting different viewpoints. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for being here today to discuss this. But I've always thought that zoos were a symptom of human arrogance, that we think it's okay to imprison animals for our entertainment. And it just boggles the mind that it's 2018 and here in Edmonton, we have probably the only lone elephant that exists in North America, as far as I know. And we have sea lions in a shopping mall. And, if we're beginning to think of animals as sentient beings worthy of consideration, you'd think that animals in entertainment would be the first thing to go. I can see how people have vested interest in agriculture and diet and what they're, but really, animals in entertainment, and what do you do with a city or city council that is so determined that we need sea lions in a shopping mall and we need a lone elephant in a zoo? How do you change that perspective?
It's a very good question. I think that's a very political question when you have local governments or other political agents who control those decisions. I know one thing that I was thinking of mentioning earlier is that there is now a bill going, I think it's still in the Senate of Canada, that's looking at banning cetaceans, so whales and dolphins in captivity. Again, it comes back to that idea of the big exciting animals that get more attention. It is also connected to the fact that cetaceans are considered amongst the most intelligent non-human animals. And so the idea that a whale, which is used to swimming in the ocean, gets put in a small enclosure is that much worse for its welfare. And it does look like incremental steps are being made in that. But I understand it's an incremental step, and we need more people asking the question of, so if it is for entertainment, such as sea lions in an entertainment exhibit as opposed to a conservation or education exhibit, if it is about the entertainment, then maybe we need to be thinking about those questions beforehand. As again is mentioned in the play, Ringling Brothers Circus was very famous for its elephants. Eventually the public pressure became too great and they did remove the elephants from their program. I believe they had said they were going to do it by 2018, but in the end, I think they removed them in 2016. And that was public pressure. Enough people were telling them that they weren't going to go to the shows if they were elephants. Maybe we should continue this after the formal, but the idea of public action is something that we will be exploring more on Wednesday when our panelists, another professor of law at the U of A, as well as a woman with a group called Voices for Animals who brought suit against the city to try and get Lucy moved. And so on that discussion, we're going to be looking more at the idea of who can put themselves into the discussion in a legal framework, like who can take action legally to try and change things for the animals. But I'll let you have the final word.
Okay. Thank you. That's a really good question. I will just say that I think that there is animal protection is a very divisive issue. There are people who care about it really deeply, people who are very threatened by it, and the larger mass of people who don't think about it very much. And I think that among the group of people who sort of care very deeply about improving animal protection, there is sometimes a sense that the sort of injustice of the current state of affairs is so grave that public institutions should bend in the face of it. But I think an important lesson for animal advocates is that there is no skipping the democracy part, right? This city hall is not just, a bunch of random people who showed up and, just have all the wrong values, right? These are elected officials who represent what people think. And I think animal advocates need to have a certain amount of humility in realizing that, because we, and I include myself among them, have a strong sense that there is something very wrong in our relationship with animals, that the sort of next step of what it looks like to convince other people to share our view is the most complicated part. And it's not just a question of logic, and it's not just a question of storytelling. It's a kind of all of these things together, and an opening to listening, because people don't like to listen to people who aren't listening to them. And so I think it's a huge, massive project that requires all kinds of skills and openness and sensitivity, which is why we need lots of thoughtful people in that task.
Thank you both. I want to remind you that we have another 4 salons coming up this week, and you can watch them on Facebook, or you can come back after the show and just see them. You don't have to pay against the show, but there's a list of them on the tables out there. You can just grab one on your way out. Thank you very much for coming. Please let your friends know about the show. Thank you. And if you want to talk a little bit more in the lobby, that's okay. We just turn the stage over
To our friends in the theater.